Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen, welcome back to the old cookbook show. And this is usually where I hold up a cookbook and I show you the book that we're working from and the recipe that we're going to do. We're going to make a mayonnaise cake. So on yesterday's show, we did a contemporary 2022 version of a chocolate mayonnaise cake. And I mentioned in that show that I've been researching the history of the mayonnaise cake and that we would be doing on future old cookbook shows the mayonnaise cake. The problem I've been having is that in my, I don't want to seem not modest, but I have a fairly extensive collection of cookbooks from prior, 1941 and older, and cooking ephemera, which are sort of all of the little circulars and little cookbooks that brands hand out. The problem I've been having is that I cannot find mayonnaise cakes in any of the books that I own. For something that seems to have such a huge cult following and a huge mythology around it, I can't find them. I cannot find them. So most of my research for the cake that I'm doing today and the cake that I'm going to do next Sunday, because we're going to do 2 mayonnaise cakes, it's a long and convoluted story, has come through researching through newspaper databases. And there's some really good newspaper databases. So in this bowl, we're going to do a 1927 mayonnaise cake. I'll start out by saying that. In this bowl, I've put some chopped nuts, some chopped dates, some baking soda, and this is some water that is still super hot. I just boiled it. I'll put that in there, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a stir. And we let that sit while we work on the rest of the stuff. Okay, just see if we can get that submerged and set that aside. Right, so like I said, 1927 in a newspaper from Oakland is what food historians generally agree. The first mention of a cake called mayonnaise cake shows up in print, in a publication. I mean, this may have been hanging around for years. Who knows? But this is the first time, 1927. Now, a lot of food bloggers completely dismiss this recipe and say it's not a mayonnaise cake because you don't actually take a jar of mayonnaise out of the fridge. You have to make the mayonnaise to put it in the cake. I mean, this is 1927 after all. 1927, that's just the way it was. So we're going to make a very basic mayonnaise. In this bowl, I have an egg, and I'm just going to give that a little bit of a whip. And then we just continue whipping the egg as we drizzle in the oil. Not too fast drizzling in the oil. So this shows up in 1927 in this newspaper. Shows up in a couple of newspapers over the next little while, but not very often. Pretty much disappears until mid-1930s, 1935, 1936 are the first ones that I start seeing it again. And this basic recipe continues into the 1950s. Another mayonnaise cake comes along and sort of dethrones this one, but it continues into the mid-1950s and then it pretty much disappears. In the 1930s, you see this mayonnaise cake, but it is associated with a mayonnaise brand. And that brand is Redwood Empire mayonnaise. And so it's often branded as the Redwood Empire mayonnaise cake. And there, obviously, you are grabbing to use their brand of mayonnaise. And so there we have a pretty basic mayonnaise. Egg and oil. At its foundation, that's what mayonnaise is. Prepared mayonnaise has other things in it. It has a little bit of vinegar to give it a bit of zing, maybe some spices, depending on what brand you buy. So next, it just becomes a cake where you dump everything together. Like, it's really not that complicated. And I would have thought that given how cakes of this nature are so loved in this time period, I would have thought that this cake would be everywhere. Like, it would be in all of the community cookbooks. It would be in the church cookbooks. It would be in the big cookbooks of the day, but it just doesn't exist. it shows up in a few recipe articles in newspapers. And in one of the newspapers, the recipe article says that, they served it at a dinner party. And they served it to guests, and they declared it fine. So, obviously it's a great cake if your dinner guest gave it such a glowing review. So into what's already in here, I'm going to add sugar, cinnamon, cocoa powder, a little bit of salt, flour, and we're going to grate in some nutmeg. And so for this version of the recipe, I haven't been able to find any mention of Hellmann's or Best Foods. Best Foods is the company that at this point owned Hellmann's. There's no mention of it. And so the time frame that we're talking about here overlaps that 1937 that is often brought up as the point where Hellmann's invents this cake. The story is that, the wife of one of the executives or one of the ad executives of Hellmann's was making a cake, didn't have enough oil and egg to make the chocolate cake, and she came up with this recipe, and they immediately printed it on all of their cookbooks and put it on the label of the mayonnaise in order to share with everybody this fantastic discovery of the cake. And so at no point through 1937, 1938, 1939, 1940, and I'll kind of stop there. Maybe let's go up to 1945. 1945, we'll stop there because the next recipe video is going to pick up at 1945. So nowhere between 1937 and 1945, when Hellmann's is now saying they came up with this recipe, can I find it in association with any Hellmann's advertising or anything like that. And I'll talk more about that later. So in goes the mayonnaise that we made. I got to tell you, having spent, an inordinate amount of time looking at mayonnaise and mayonnaise recipes through the 1930s. Mayonnaise was really revered in the 1930s, 1920s, and 1930s. People loved it, and they took their time to make all kinds of really wild things with it. There were even mayonnaise serving sets so that you could serve mayonnaise at the table. That's it. Looks like it's completely mixed. So I've got a 9x9 cake pan that I've greased and put a parchment sling in. And so we'll put this into the cake pan. I've got the oven preheated at 350 degrees. The last of it in there. A couple of taps and into the oven.
Hey, Glen.
Hey, Jules.
Hey, friends. Cake?
It's cake.
It's a very slick-looking cake.
It is a very slick-looking cake.
Shiny.
Yes.
Cake somehow.
It's a very moist cake.
Yes.
It is very moist.
I get that impression.
Let's give it a go. I like that.
It's a really moist.
Yeah. Moist. I like the dates.
There's dates in it. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Chocolate flavor is only sort of there.
Yeah.
If you tasted it blind, I don't know, would you say chocolate?
Wouldn't be the first thing that came to your mind.
No.
But it's no. And yet I wouldn't say, oh, it's a date cake either.
No.
It's actually, the flavors all kind of meld together really nicely.
Into something new.
Mm-hmm.
Into something new. I like the nuts in there too. Okay, so I whipped up sort of the basic mayonnaise to put in this.
Okay.
Egg and oil. The oil that you choose, the flavor will really come through in the cake.
Actually, I don't really notice that it's an oily cake.
No, I don't notice it either. But I think if you used a really flavorful oil,
fair enough.
It would come.
Like an olive oil would certainly
change the
flavor.
You could put in between 3/4 and a full cup of prepared mayonnaise.
Okay, I guess if it's
yeah, that would definitely work. So this cake, 1927 is the first time it appears. It carries on into the 1950s. And we're going to talk about this cake next week, which is from 1945, which is the next iteration of
the cake.
Of the cake.
Okay. Now I'm curious about how it's different.
And then, and we'll talk about this next week, this cake, by the time you get to the 1960s, you see ads for the cake or pieces about the cake that says this cake is old-fashioned because it's from 1945. By 1962, this is old-fashioned. So you know what they do?
They reinvent it?
They add raisins and nuts. So
nothing's new again.
Not quite dates and nuts, but in order to take this old-fashioned cake and make it new in 1960, they add raisins and nuts.
Which is funny though, because I mean the really old recipes all have dates, and then the newer recipes have raisins.
Have raisins instead, and it just goes round and round and round, and nothing is new. Thanks for stopping by. We'll see you next week for the next iteration of the mayonnaise cake.